Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
The vulnerable red-cockaded woodpecker is known to be found in national park units throughout the southeast. Big Cypress National Preserve and Everglades National Park in Florida, Cumberland Island National Seashore in Georgia, and Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee are just a few of the parks that either are or once were home to the woodpecker. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service moved to downlist the red-cockaded woodpecker from being an endangered species to being a threatened species. While that normally would be welcome news, the decision has been criticized as being premature and ignorant of climate change threats to the species. This week, the Traveler's Lynn Riddick discusses this decision with the Southeast Program Director of Defenders of Wildlife and the thinking behind that organization's belief that this decision comes at a questionable time.
Smoky's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smoky's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokyslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference too at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Now for some great news. Now through December 31st, we have an opportunity to amplify the impact of donations to the Traveler. Newsmatch, powered through the Institute for Nonprofit News, is the largest grassroots fundraising campaign designed specifically to support nonprofit news organizations, having raised over $300 million since 2017. Through the Traveler's Newsmatch campaign, INN will match any individual contributor donations up to $1,000. Or sign up for a small monthly donation, and Newsmatch will match that 12x. Either way you stack it, donating now will double the effectiveness of your efforts. Your support enables the Traveler's nonprofit newsroom to not only help you explore the national park system, but keep you informed on how the National Park Service is managing the system and how Congress is funding and directing the Park Service. This daily coverage would not be possible without the support of readers and listeners like you. If you've been thinking about supporting the Traveler's coverage, now is the best time to do it. Your support will get the Traveler's Newsmatch campaign off to a solid start and help keep his newsroom on strong footing. If you believe in the work the Traveler's doing, please give to double the impact of your donation.
With me today is Ben Prater, Southeast Program Director for Defenders of Wildlife, calling in from Asheville, North Carolina. We're going to discuss the red-cockaded woodpecker, which was recently downlisted from an endangered species to a threatened species. Ben's organization and others believe this was premature in light of the devastation caused to habitats by Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Hi, Ben. Welcome to The Traveler.
Hi there, Lynn. It's great to be with you today.
Great to have you. Well, Ben, why don't you start by telling us what your organization does and how it's involved in the protection of wildlife?
Of course. Well, Defenders of Wildlife is an organization that's been around over 75 years. Our mission is dedicated to the protection of all native animals and plants in their natural communities. And we take a very straightforward approach in achieving that mission, working to protect and restore imperiled species across the continent. We work to transform policies, promote innovative solutions, and hold government agencies accountable to decisions that impact wildlife and our human communities.
How many people are with the organization?
I think as of right now, we are just a little over, maybe around 130 employees on staff.
So, explain what goes into determining whether species are listed as threatened or endangered. What organization or organizations make those decisions, and who keeps the tallies? How does all of that work?
Great question. So, all of this happens under the regulations put forward of the Endangered Species Act. So, the process by which species are assessed for being listed, in other words, a species that is nearing a threat of extinction in its near future, is how that's evaluated. And there's a whole rubric and a set of criteria. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the primary agency that takes on that work. They, of course, reach out to outside experts. And so they make decisions about if a species is warranted to be on the endangered species list. And again, the mechanism there is to prevent extinction. And so by listing a species, what that does is it marshals resources and priorities within the Fish and Wildlife Service and their sister and brother agencies across the federal spectrum to engage in proactive and direct action and activities to sustain, increase populations of imperiled wildlife species. So once a species is listed, we go to work. Now, as time goes on, things like recovery plans are developed that have apply the science to guide actions that we're taking to conserve and restore and recover these species. It's a very science-based process, establishes criteria for when we know we can say, all right, once we meet this threshold or this goal, whether it's the population or the acreage of habitat, we can then reassess what we call the status. So the listing status of that species. And that's done fairly routinely on a 5-year basis. And at each time they evaluate based off the recovery criteria, the status of the species, and then make a determination about whether that species should stay on the list or be downlisted, going from endangered to threatened. And there's different thresholds for those classifications. Again, being threatened means a species is vulnerable to being endangered, and being endangered means a species is vulnerable to going extinct. So in the cases of the red-cockaded woodpecker, this species was listed as endangered. In other words, a species that was threatened to extinction. And that was essentially the factors that played into that were large-scale, massive conversion and loss of habitat, particularly old and mature longleaf pine forest across the southern coastal plain in the southeastern U.S. And so the recovery plan worked to ensure that we could restore that habitat, connect that habitat, and really give those birds what they needed to rebound. And I'm happy to say that even though we're disappointed in the decision to downlist, we are celebrating the progress that's been made on recovering the red-cockaded woodpecker. And it's been really incredible effort over the last several decades, involving a whole host of partners led by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but also including agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, as well as state wildlife agencies, and even organizations like the Department of Defense, who've had a role to play in recovering this species on federal Department of Defense lands, military bases, and installations.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that, but I did want to ask you about the latest numbers of species that have been determined to be on the verge of extinction. I think I read that it was over 1 million, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And also to find out if the number of threatened species is that list increasing?
Absolutely. So I think what we are enduring and living through right now is certainly what we call the biodiversity crisis. The facts you just shared outline that, and then there's an unprecedented number of species that are threatened with extinction due to habitat loss, due to exploitation, due to invasive and non-native invasive species affecting the quality of that habitat, disease, and other pathogens. There's a whole host of threats out there. Many of these threats are synergistic in that they compound to make life really difficult for a lot of wildlife species, and particularly those that are most vulnerable, that have low populations or what we call high endemism. They're only found in a few particular places. And so to meet and answer the call to face that crisis, we really have to recognize that things like the Endangered Species Act are really our best defense against extinction. So preserving the integrity of that law and keeping the policies under that law moving forward in a way that helps us address these growing threats. And those threats are magnifying worldwide, but in the U.S. we have a mission, and the ESA makes that mission very clear. It's essentially a moral calling to ensure that our actions don't jeopardize the existence of other life forms on this planet.
Can you think of any species that have recently been downlisted from endangered to threatened?
Of course. I'll just name one that's in the region I work in, which is the Florida manatee. Also was recently, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Forgive me, I don't have the exact date top of mind, but due to the increase in populations for Florida manatees, the decision was made to downlist, to move that species from endangered to threatened. And manatee is also a good example because the decision that was made to downlist the manatee is not dissimilar from the decision that was made to downlist the RCW, in that in doing that downlisting, a special rule, what we call a 4D rule, that's just the name of the section of the ESA, is put in place to ensure that conservation measures, efforts that are underway that have allowed us to sustain and grow these populations, stay part of the conservation actions moving forward. So even though a species goes down on the list, we're still acknowledging through special rulemaking that certain things need to continue. So, for example, in the case of manatees, we need to continue to preserve warm water habitat. We need to continue to help mitigate the changes from the climate, as well as ensuring these animals could transition from unnatural sources of warm water to natural sources of warm water. So it's something, again, to celebrate, but we have to make sure we're doing it in a measured way. So one of the things I think we are happy with when it comes to RCW is that we do have a 4D rule in place that allows us to continue those essential conservation practices and measures that have allowed us to achieve that step in recovery. I think what's important to acknowledge with listing and downlisting is that conservation is a long road. Many of these species have experienced, a century or two of challenges, of habitat loss, of population collapse. And so it takes a long time to move these species, taking necessary steps to rebuild their populations, to make sure that they're redundant, meaning they exist in multiple places. They're resilient, meaning that they have enough habitat, for example, to sustain impacts from hurricanes, as you mentioned. So all those factors come into play. And I think what we have to always guard ourselves for is making sure that if we do move a species down the list, that again, we have those rules in place that don't allow folks to strip away protections. So for example, in the case of manatees, when that species was first proposed for downlisting, some were advocating for a delisting, which would have allowed them to relax things like speed zones for boating, which is a major source of impacts and threats to manatees. So those kinds of things can really upend, decades of recovery, and was really or why, taking the RCW down the list is a cause for concern, because we need to ensure that we've met those recovery goals and that we're doing it in a stepwise manner that doesn't leave these species in a lurch in terms of funding and resources, staffing resources, in terms of alignment between the state and the federal government, in terms of what needs to be done, and incentives that are out there for landowners and other land managers to continue to do the right thing. So that really, in many ways, sort of boils down to, I think, our overriding concern about the delist, or excuse me, the downlisting of RCWs, is just understanding that it could impact the amount of resources that continue to go towards this species and could jeopardize long-term or jeopardize the trend we're seeing, which is a species on the path to recovery. And then a more fundamental issue is that I mentioned recovery plans earlier. Those are really a central scientific document that provides the guidebook for how we get these species on track for recovery. And in the case of RCWs, we're still well short of meeting those recovery criteria in the vast majority of the species range. So, for example, just to put some numbers on it, There are about 36 total, what we call population units across the Southeast, where we are working on recovering populations of RCWs.
RCW is the
Oh, yeah.
red-cockaded woodpecker that we're talking about.
Yes, we use that acronym because red-cockaded woodpecker takes a little bit of room. But yeah, thank you for that clarification. But again, we have 36 red-cockaded recovery units on the landscape. Within that, about 11 of those are potentially or recovered. So you're talking about around 30% of all of the known populations of red-cockaded woodpeckers on the landscape have met the criteria for recovery. So just looking at the numbers, we are concerned that we have not made enough of a gain. We have not met the goal line, so to speak, outlined in the recovery plan. That gives us a lot of confidence that we aren't going to continue to see opportunities for the species to decline or conservation practices or resources steered away that might otherwise have helped to continue this species on the proper path.
Have you ever seen one of these woodpeckers?
I have. In fact, when I was a grad student, I spent a good bit of time in eastern North Carolina in an area called the Palmetto Pear Tree Preserve, which was known for red-cockaded woodpeckers and very unique habitat there, Pocosin swamps and pine forest that are oftentimes considered to be a little bit more on the margins of quality habitat for RCWs, but those populations are sustained in those systems. So yeah, I have spent time with the species, and in fact, even used it as the recovery plan is something I studied pretty intently because it was a very, very successful and very exciting process for recovery. The red-cockaded woodpecker program really set a lot of new standards for how we recover species across a vast landscape, and particularly a landscape like we have in the Southeast, which is 90% private lands, which makes managing for endangered species that more complex, and why we have to have agency resources to help manage that.
So you mentioned the longleaf pine forests. What other vital habitats are necessary for this woodpecker? And tell us a little bit about the migration range.
Of course. So, red-cockaded woodpeckers are associated pretty strongly, meaning that the habitats they inhabit, their preference is really for those mature and old growth longleaf pine forests. And that relates to their ecology. So, longleaf pine is a significant range across the southern coastal plain. It's a habitat type that's dominated by regular fire, and that fire helps maintain sort of open savanna-like conditions that are great for all of the insects that RCWs eat, and also the trees play a very important role. This is a species of woodpecker that has some pretty unique adaptations. First of all, it excavates. We all know woodpeckers knock cavities in trees. They do it for different reasons. Red-cockaded woodpeckers do that for nesting habitat, and they actually excavate living trees, which is unique. And what that allows for is the sap to flow all around that cavity to prevent nest predation. Further adaptation is pretty unique to RCWs is that they actually form small colonies, family groups. So in fact, when they raise their young, they have 3 or 4 other birds, including the breeding pair, that will actually actively participate in rearing and feeding that young. So it's a pretty amazing animal that's very adapted to a very unique ecosystem, again, that was once very widespread, but has been denuded and logged over pretty significantly. And so, when you talk about migration, I think one of the things we need to talk about is habitat connectivity and quality. In that, what we have now, with some exceptions, but overall, the predominating way we preserve habitat is in pockets, of continuing to protect areas that are still in longleaf, and then on the margins of those and adjacent to those, working to recover and restore longleaf pine forest. So as you hold on to those core habitats and restore acreages around them, you will see this natural emigration of these birds as they bring themselves out into new territories. The challenge we have is making sure those pockets of prime habitat don't remain isolated. And that's really one of the concerns that brings us into focus on the impacts of climate change fueled powerful storms that are ripping through our region, with Helene and Milton and others. If those habitats are isolated, it may mean that a single large storm event can wipe out an entire recovery unit or population. And so, there's this sort of the idea of putting all your eggs in one basket. We want to make sure we have lots of eggs, lots of baskets, and that allows these species to be resilient. And that's another criticism we have over the decision to downlist at this moment is based on the recovery criteria and based on the species ecology, it's fair to say that we may not quite have enough protected and connected habitat to continue to sustain the recovery of the species.
Yeah, because it was late September that Hurricane Helene stretched more than 500 miles across Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee. And it was probably one of the most destructive hurricanes to hit the Southeast. So add to that Hurricane Milton in October. So I was curious to know what storms like that did to fall migration and birds in particular. Do they flee the area and settle elsewhere? Do they make habitats there if they're not ideal? I wondered if many immature woodpeckers perished in storms like that. I mean, where do they go?
Great question. So again, with enough protected and connected habitat, these species can move out of the path of these storm events. Now, granted, in the case of Helene, we were talking about an impact area that was well beyond the potential escape path or range of escape for a lot of species, including RCWs. When we think about birds more in general, yes, in the early and late fall, there's a lot of migration that's happening as birds move north to south. For RCWs, they don't necessarily have any kind of long distance migration. They're really keying in on just where habitat is available. But to your question, yes, migration is incredibly impacted by these large storms. You'll see birds blown off course, birds that migrate over water face a more precarious set of circumstances. There is nowhere to land. They get blown off course. So you may see, and you'll see this in the birding community, reports of birds that are well outside their range on migration because these storms do push them around. And so that is one of those other direct impacts that does affect bird species a little more in general. With the red-cockaded woodpecker, our primary concern is these hurricanes and storm events having really damaging impacts to habitat. For example, I mentioned the eggs in one basket sort of metaphor, but if you're thinking about you've got an incredible population of woodpeckers established, they're kind of in an island of really good habitat, and you could have one storm come and just lay those trees all down, which makes them functionally useless as habitat, those woodpeckers. And so those woodpeckers could be directly impacted by the storm events. Hopefully they get out of the way. But if they don't have suitable habitat to immigrate into, they may not reproduce. They may not survive. They may not have their food sources. And so sometimes there may even be a delayed effect. Hurricanes may come in, damage habitat, but it may be a few years before we start seeing numbers of birds decline because to sustain their populations, we have to see successful breeding year in and year out.
So these woodpeckers look a lot like ladderbacks and downy woodpeckers, without the stripe, of course, down their back. So describe what these woodpeckers look like. How do you tell the difference?
Well, you did a great job of describing it. I think for this species in particular, its namesake is the sort of red sash or cockade that's right behind its eye line. Also, they're a woodpecker that you will see in longleaf pine forests. So the habitat gives you an idea that you are, in fact, seeing red-cockaded woodpeckers. Oftentimes, if you're out in that habitat and observing the species, you may not see the birds, but you'll definitely see signs of their cavities. Up high in the tree, an excavated cavity with sap flowing all around it. And generally, when you're in an area like that, given enough time and being quiet, you may have a chance to see one using those cavities, particularly in breeding season as well. And feeding up and down along the trees and along the grass line, things like that. So they're pretty, woodpeckers overall are just an incredible, highly adapted group of birds and really exciting to see and play an important ecological role.
So the Apalachicola National Forest is one of the national park units that is home to these woodpecker populations. And that's close to sort of where a lot of hurricane damage occurred. Do you know if that woodpecker population has been affected there yet?
I do believe I have heard that there were a few what we call clusters, which again are these family groups, were impacted. The Apalachicola is no stranger to large storm events, but it's also a good model. The Apalachicola has a really large scale effort to recover the woodpecker and has done a remarkable job. One of the most successful recovery units. Again, comparing the 36 units across the region, Apalachicola has been really superlative. And, in many ways, oftentimes in this decision is no different for downlisting. They say, oh, we're doing so well over here. It's okay if we're not doing as good over here. But again, with the storms we're seeing, with the disturbances we're seeing, it is critical that we don't just assume that places where the woodpeckers are doing really well will always provide suitable habitat. So making sure that we have connected and reproducible habitat across the region is our best sort of insurance policy as we ride out the worst impacts of a chaotic climate future.
What kind of woodpecker numbers are we talking about?
Right now, the population is estimated around 7,800 clusters. So you could assume that is as few as, in terms of individual birds, it's as few as double that number or as much as 4 times that number.
So a cluster varies in its number.
It does. It could be 2, 3, 4, up to 6 birds. So it's not a precise number. I think what's more important with that number is you look at where the species was when it was listed as endangered. And that was fewer than, I think, 1,200 clusters range wide. So again, we've made considerable progress over the last couple decades. But you have to recognize that population numbers alone aren't the only measure of success. And that's why I keep sort of drumming on this idea of habitat, because that's really the critical piece that's going to allow us to sustain and recover these woodpeckers. And if I didn't mention it already, I should say it right now, which is this longleaf pine ecosystem is critically important for a whole host of other imperiled wildlife, whether it's frosted flatwood salamanders, pine barrens tree frogs, gopher frogs, indigo snakes, gopher tortoises. So again, in many ways, the RCW is a sentinel species, meaning that by virtue of protecting it, you're getting benefits to a whole host of other critters that utilize those habitats.
So, a Department of Interior news release said the decision to downlist the species is, quote, the result of 5 decades of collaborative conservation efforts between the Interior Department, federal and state partners, tribes, the private sector, and private landowners that have resulted in increasing populations of these remarkable birds throughout their range. Is it your position to move the woodpecker back to the endangered list? And if so, what kind of recourses do organizations have to protest or reverse downlisting decisions? Or is it just that you are putting an alert out there not to take our foot off the gas?
Yeah, I think I would summarize our organization's position sort of in line with the latter. We have a decision, and anytime a federal decision is made, there is a recourse. Typically, at this stage, that would involve bringing federal litigation, so a citizen suit challenge, basically saying that this decision was arbitrary and capricious or did not incorporate this information or that information. And that can be, quite a bit of loggerheads, but it's certainly not something that Defenders of Wildlife in particular has ever been shy about. We often use litigation as a tool to advance recovery for endangered species. I firmly believe in this case that it is probably not something we would challenge on its face. And again, to your point, it's really just kind of like hey, glad we're celebrating, but please make sure, that's what we were looking at is this 4D rule to make sure it's strong, to make sure that protections aren't minimized. But I think the more insidious challenge, particularly as we move into this next presidential administration, are recognizing that the resources are very limited. And so if you're a Fish and Wildlife Service regional staff person managing your budget and you have to say, well, we have this critical critically endangered species that is a high priority, needs our focus and attention. We have this other species that is making progress. We've downlisted it. You can see how in that sort of world of conservation triage, we may be putting resources, hopefully at least putting resources where they're needed for recovering critically endangered species, but it does require us to take resources away because it's not an endless pot of funding. And that is something I think we're especially concerned about moving into this next administration, because the Fish and Wildlife Service, in many ways, I believe, is moving these decisions to downlist and delist out prematurely just simply because they don't have the resources or any guarantee of having the resources to continue to manage these programs successfully. Again, that's just a thought of mine. I don't have any way to know that for certain, but it certainly is a concern. And, when we think about an agency that is starved for funding and appropriations, that has major staff reductions, some of which are about to continue to come, we really need to think about making sure that we are not reducing protections or taking our eye off the ball, or pick your sports metaphor, not crossing the goal line simply because the resources are not promised. And we need to make sure that we're giving the species that we've invested in 50 years of concerted effort, that we're able to make sure that effort is not wasted and is sustained, to really make sure that future generations have the opportunity to enjoy this marvelous species.
Have you had any communication between your organization and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the RCW?
Well, in general, we maintain really good relationships and communication flows well. There are many times, many examples of things we work on in direct collaboration with our friends and partners in the service. And there are other times where we see things differently. This is an example where, again, I think we are proud and celebrating the incredible work that's gone into this recovery effort, but we disagree that now is the time to pull back. So I think that dialogue remains respectful. I personally have not spoken to anyone directly with the service on the heels of this decision, but I'm sure those conversations will come.
Project 2025 proposes to reinstate the first Trump administration's rules pertaining to the Endangered Species Act definitions for critical habitat exclusions, and reinstating the administration's rules pertaining to the Migratory Bird Act. Thoughts on all that?
Well, we have seen this film before. As you mentioned, these are things pulled directly from some of the less than successful, at least from their point of view, efforts to undermine the ESA in the first Trump administration. So I can say without a doubt that we have learned a lot from that experience, and we'll be doing everything in our power to ensure that the integrity of the Endangered Species Act is maintained. The important aspects of the act, such as critical habitat designation, and in other laws that intersect with the ESA, like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, are not undermined. I think what the significant concern here is really, if you look at where, the types of laws, particularly environmental regulations, that get attacked, it's ones where they have a lot of power to command a different path. So, for example, the ESA is a very powerful law when it comes to decisions around development, decisions around what federal agencies can and can't do on public land, for example. So these types of moves are really an aggressive attempt to undermine some of the most promising aspects of the law when it comes to making a difference for conservation. And I think what you're seeing is most of these policies that were attempted, some won, some failed, and what they're sort of doing the redux on this time around really focuses on freeing up any kind of regulatory oversight to allow for development, oil and gas exploration, extraction, all these kind of things to take place in areas that will impact endangered species on our public lands, within our conservation lands in the public trust. So it's, I think we're bracing to weather another storm. But I think if you look at how we've defeated these kind of proposals in the past, it's because the ESA regardless of some feelings about the regulatory burdens or red tape that it puts on certain folks, is wildly popular. Conserving wildlife, charismatic species in particular, is a wildly popular concept here in the US. Again, as I mentioned, the ESA is really a moral calling. And so for a lot of us, that law really represents the best of what's possible in terms of what our democracy can do to choose a path forward to sustain a wild nature for future generations.
Have there been other species that have been, in your view, prematurely downlisted from endangered to threatened?
Nothing comes to the top of mind right now, but there are some species that we have been concerned about. So I mentioned the manatee earlier. In fact, there's even an effort now to have that species re-uplisted in the wake of massive die-off of seagrass beds, which was their major food source. Another example that is forthcoming and one that we are also pushing back on is the effort to potentially delist the wood stork. This is another species that is really reliant on really specific habitat needs for wetlands. In other words, natural wetlands, seasonally will have different heights, and these birds are adapted for nesting and feeding at different times of year based on those patterns. And those patterns have been wildly disrupted, from ditching and draining wetlands to modifying wetlands across the range. And then that bird also faced really significant impacts from taking feathers for the hat industry, kind of crazy thing that happened in the turn of the century. So their numbers were low, their habitats are diminished. And again, another similar analogy to RCW, which is a species done a lot of work on for a long time. It's doing well in some places, but a lot of what we see the service banking on is like, yeah, well, they've got this habitat they can go to and that habitat, so they're doing okay. They have a chance, and we don't disagree, but we feel that's extremely risky, particularly as you think about where we've seen regulations for wetlands and protection of clean water going over the last decade. In the previous Trump administration, we saw the Waters of the U.S. rule really get turned on its ear and lost federal protections for wetlands to the tune of millions and millions of acres. And at that time, that decision rested on, well, the states can handle it. Well, the states can handle it. Most states don't have clean water programs, or their permitting agencies are just rubber stamps for industry. So it's important that we have federal oversight. And I think these types of conversations really force us all to confront the idea that in the United States of America, in our constitutional republic, what is the role and the synergy between federal government and regulations, the needs of states and private landowners? And if anything, the RCW is a great example of how we can overcome some of those barriers or perceptions and do good work together. What I worry about and what I see, and I think premature decisions around downlisting are an indicator of that, is us sort of really putting less effort in keeping the full range of environmental laws and regulations connecting to do what's best for conservation in our environment. And you're going to see this a lot in the next 2 to 4 years, which is continued relentless attacks on the role of the federal government. And I think, unfortunately, many voters, many Americans don't quite understand. Most of these agencies just kind of exist in the backgrounds of all of our lives. It's only when they impact us directly that we may form an opinion about it. But I think it's so concerning to think that we may really have an administration that's going to attack the Department of the Interior, that's going to attack the EPA, that's going to do everything in its power it can to tell the narrative that these institutions that have been so wildly successful for so long and have really been the backbone of our ability to sustain wildlife and human health, people are going to start forming bad opinions about that. And I think that's really scary to me. Again, you're talking about an administration that is poised to really work to undermine people's opinions and support for the important work of the federal government. And so that's a larger concern I have. And again, like I said, I think these downlisting decisions are a little bit of pretext for what may be to come. I really hope that folks take some time to get out and enjoy and visit a longleaf pine forest, get out and see places where these woodpeckers exist. I personally firmly believe that being connected to these places, being connected to these species, really inspires a level of advocacy that all of us are going to need as Americans to continue to ensure a brighter future for wildlife and future generations. So that's really my only final thought, is just encouraging folks to get outside and enjoy what we have and what we've done to successfully conserve these endangered species.
That's good advice. Ben, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we'll be following these issues and more as the months and weeks go by. So thanks again for your time today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was great to be with you and explore this important topic, and I hope to speak with you again soon.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Next week, with time running out on the current session of Congress, we're going to take a look at some of the public lands legislation that could wind up in a year-end omnibus package. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
Audio of the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker was provided by Andrew Spencer via xenocanto.org, XC 109888. Accessible at www.xenocanto.org/109888. The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.